All right, we are live. Welcome to session 3 of the massive open online course for the master's degree in digital currencies in the University of Nicosia. This is Andreas Antonopoulos, and I'll be answering your questions for the next hour. Questions that you've been submitting in the forums. We've got some great questions for today. A lot of stuff about public and private keys, as well as a bit of recap on mining. Let's see. How is everybody? Can you hear me okay? Let's quickly check with the sound. We maybe have some problem with the sound. All right, can we make sure that the volume is on full? 1 second. Everybody give me just 1 second. We're going to do a few good checks. Volume is on full. Can we make sure we're plugged in to the microphone? That's plugged in. All right, we check the 1 second, everyone. Can we make sure we're not on speaker on the front of the screen? No, that's correct. All right. Very, very low volume. All right, hang on everyone. We've got a slight technical problem. Andreas, if you can take me off screen for just a second, and I'm going to try and fix this problem. We seem to have a connection problem. Now it's fine. Okay, great. Take 2. Hey, everyone. Welcome to MOOC 10, the third session of the massive open online course for the master's degree in digital currencies for the University of Nicosia. Ignore everything that happened before. That was just a test. Now we're great. We're starting again. Got lots of great questions from everyone. Thank you for doing your homework and asking all of these great questions. Let's start right away. First question comes from Eric. If a private key cannot feasibly in practice be derived from its paired public key, how can a message encrypted with the private key be decrypted using the public key? The basis of asymmetric cryptography is that a message encrypted with one key can be decrypted with the other, but you can't convert one key to the other. And this is because of the mathematics used in elliptic curve. And this is the same with digital signatures. You can verify a digital signature with the public key, even if you don't know the private key. And if you verify a signature, you can then be sure that the person who applied that private signature, or the algorithm that applied that digital signature, had the private key at the time that they applied the signature. So anything that's encrypted with one part of the key can be decrypted with the other. And that's how public key cryptography or asymmetric cryptography works. And it's asymmetric. So that's why you have two keys. What's encrypted with one of the keys can be decrypted with the other. And but you can't derive the private key from the public key. Mario asks, could I start a new key by starting with a private key that is my own creation, say 32 characters of personal random data? Absolutely, you can. By 32 characters, I assume you mean 32 hexadecimal characters, which are 4 bits each. So that will give you 128 bits key. You actually need 64 hexadecimal characters in order to get a 256-bit key, which is going to be stronger. And a 256-bit key can be generated by generating 64 random characters. Here's the problem. Humans suck at randomness. We are very, very bad as entropy generators. The problem lies between this ear and this ear in the brain. And the problem is that this is a machine for creating patterns. And it is a machine that creates patterns even when there are no patterns there. So it's a really bad system for creating random numbers. Now, a very good way to do this, what you're describing, which is create your own private key with a source of randomness, is you could take, for example, a coin. You could take a coin and just flip it 256 times and write down each time whether it comes up heads or tails. And let's call heads 0 and tails 1. That's a binary random number generator. And just flip it 256 times, write down 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, etc. 256 binary digits. That's a key. And it's actually a pretty good source of randomness as long as the coin is new, even, and properly balanced. A better way, actually, is to use dice. And there are a number of tutorials on how to use dice on the internet. One of the classic tricks that you can try is you can buy professional dice, the same type that are used in casinos. Now, these dice are transparent. They're very carefully machined to very exact shape and weight distribution so that they are absolutely perfectly balanced. And these will produce random numbers between 1 and 6. You get 2 of these dice, and you've got random numbers between 2 and 12. And you can use these in order to produce a key. So again, the same mechanism, you're just converting from base 12 to base 16 or 64 or whatever. And you can just roll dice and produce enough randomness to be able to generate a private key. Generally speaking, any source of randomness that is truly random can work. Some people use, for example, special random hardware that generates random numbers through certain physical effects that occur inside electronics, from cosmic rays to cosmic radiation, really, to thermal noise that's generated inside electronic equipment that is truly random. And they use that as a source of true physical randomness in order to produce random numbers. But any process that generates random numbers will work to generate a key, and then all you need to do is convert it into the format that you want. Mario's question has a follow-up. So if I generate my own private key, let's say by throwing dice or flipping a coin, beyond that being very weak security, like weak randomness, would it work technically, or is there a chance of a collision if I don't use a double SHA-256 hash of it? You don't really need to use a hash function, but what the hash function does is it allows you to clean that random source and compress it to 256 bits. So because the private key you want is 256 bits, and because the output of a hash function is, in the case of SHA-256, 256 bits, regardless of how much the input is, what you can do is you can put more entropy in and then compress that with SHA down to 256 bits that you can use for a key. So a lot of random number generators use that technique. They'll put maybe 512 bits of randomness and then push that through SHA-256, get 256 bits of entropy out of that. It's clean, it's 256 bits, and you have the SHA-256 hash algorithm. You use it as a compressor. Very often in random number generators, you see that. For example, random number generators that use thermal noise or some physical process will basically pass that through a hash function in order to clean it and compress it to the right size. Now, having said, the fact that you can do this doesn't mean you should do this. In fact, you shouldn't. Part of the reason you shouldn't try to build your own cryptography is because cryptography is very, very tricky. There's a saying in cryptography, don't roll your own crypto. And Don't roll your own crypto, or DRYOC, is a saying for a reason. It is very easy to make a subtle mistake that you don't notice and create a pattern that is not random that gets revealed in your private key in such a way that someone can guess your private key. If you don't feed sufficient quality randomness into this process, let's say, for example, you try to use a coin and the coin isn't balanced, so it produces more ones than zeros, that could lead to trouble. It's best, if you're not an expert, not to try these things and to use a device designed specifically or a well-tested cryptographic algorithm designed by an expert that has been tested by thousands or even millions of users to work correctly. There are plenty of those out there. Wallets use well-established cryptographic routines that are provided by the operating system. And most of the time, they get it right. Sometimes they don't. And that's much better than trying to roll your own. Next question. Let's check in the chat room quickly and see how everyone's doing. All right. Next question comes from Eustathios. During the procedure of creating a BTC address, we double hash the data to produce the hash, which is the actual address. What is the benefit of double hashing? The benefit of double hashing is that your public key is not what is revealed on the blockchain when you receive Bitcoin. And that gives you an advantage in case the algorithm that's used to derive the public key, which is called the elliptic curve multiplication algorithm, if that elliptic curve multiplication algorithm is compromised, then in the very, very small chance that you could reverse a public key to a private key, if no one can see your public key and instead they see a double hash, that has an advantage, because if you use cryptocurrencies correctly, where you only use an address once, the only time your public key becomes visible is the moment that you spend all of the money from that address. And therefore, even if someone was able to take that and brute force it and derive the private key, by the time they did that, the money's already spent. The address is empty. You're done. Now, this has very important implications for one particular category of problem, which is this concept of quantum computing. A lot of people are worried what happens when quantum computing is widely available, or at least available to very well-funded organizations, intelligence agencies, and governments. Can't they use quantum computing to reverse public keys to private keys? Theoretically, the elliptic curve algorithm is vulnerable to a quantum computer. Of course, it has to be a quantum computer that can do computation across a very large number of qubits, which don't exist today. But what if this happened? Well, here's the good news. There are no public keys on the blockchain until the money is spent for you to easily crack and reverse it. And the hashing algorithm is not as quantum vulnerable as the elliptic curve algorithm, which means that essentially Bitcoin has two layers of protection. And when you publish an address to receive money, that address, because it's the double hash, is actually a lot harder to attack with a quantum computer than if it was simply a public key. The other benefit of double hashing is that if you always present a hash of an address, if you always present an address which is a double hash of your public key, it provides a layer of abstraction which in programming can be very useful, because what you can do is have a type of address which is presented again as the outcome of a hash, but instead of a public key, it's actually a script behind it. And this is called pay-to-script hash. So you can have more complexity at the layer below the double hashing of the address. So maybe it's not a public key. Maybe it's a script. Maybe it's a multisig. Maybe it's a lightning payment. All of those things present as hashes. And so you never know if what you're paying to is a SegWit address, a multisig address, a script, a lightning channel. All of those are hashes. You have one form of address that is common, but a lot of different payment systems that can use that form of address. So that's called abstraction. So one benefit is abstraction. The other one is protection against vulnerability in the elliptic curve. All right, those are some great questions on private public key. Let me quickly check in the chat room. How's everyone doing? Do we have good audio? I'm going to take a little break here and drink some tea while you tell me if we have good audio. There's a slight delay, so I have to wait until someone... Oh, there we go. Yes, thank you. Great audio in the chat room. Now I know. We can continue. Thank you, Jean, for letting me know that the audio is great. By coincidence, the next question is yours. Jean asks, is the hash rate of the Bitcoin network the total hash power of all miners? Yes, it is. And the way that works is that this hash rate of the Bitcoin network varies significantly all the time, because imagine a warehouse that contains 20,000 mining kits or mining computers that are all mining. Out of those 20,000 mining computers, let's say on average, on the average day, you have 0.5% failure, electrical failure, thermal failure, network failure, et cetera. So some of those miners are not working there. Some of them are working. Some of them are turning off. Some of them are starting up. Some new ones are being installed. So even in a single warehouse full of mining computers, we're still talking about, maybe 200 computers, 100 computers for the mining computers that are not working on any day. So that's some variation that's happening in a single mining farm. Now imagine that at the same time, some companies are deciding to shut down their mining operations. Some others have a power cut. Another mining farm got flooded yesterday, and yet 5 more mining farms have been built since last week. So all of this variation in the hash power, you can't really see that from the perspective of Bitcoin, because what you see is the average. And the average is expressed in terms of how fast blocks are being found for the current difficulty. And that gives you an idea of approximately how much average mining power there was over the last 10 minutes. But that's an approximation. But yes, that is reflecting the totality of all of the mining computers that are out there that are connected to the network and working at this particular moment. And you can measure that average. And if you look at the graph of mining power, you'll notice it is very, very noisy. It's got a lot of volatility like that. And that's because of new miners joining, old miners leaving, equipment failures, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a smooth line. Jean has a follow-up question. Does a mining pool split its workload by allocating a start point and an end point, presumably the maximum nonce number minus the current hashed header for each miner, so that it eliminates duplication across its mining pool? That depends on the mining pool protocol. So there are a number of different mining pool protocols, from very old ones like Stratum to more modern ones. And these different mining pool protocols use different approaches. Some of them send only part of the header to miners, and the miners themselves choose which transactions to put from the mempool. In other cases, the mining pool operator decides which transactions to select from the mempool and put in the block, and sends a complete header to it be mined, and then can allocate a different range of nonces to different miners. And also, the timestamp can be varied, which is a very important part of the header. So that can add some additional randomness to the miner. Given all of that, you don't really need to allocate a range. If each of the mining computers used just a different starting point within that, perhaps even picked randomly, the chances of that producing the same hashes is pretty low. when so to explain a tiny bit better, the second part of your question was, do they do this so that they can make sure they eliminate duplication across the mining pool? The space across which you're searching is so unfathomably large that the chance of duplication, even if you were picking a random starting point, is extremely small. So you don't really need to engineer eliminating duplication, as far as I know, in order to achieve pooled mining. Arnid asks, what happens when the hash rate drops so hard that new blocks are very slow? It takes much longer than 2 weeks to compensate difficulty, right? Would the Bitcoin blockchain network come to a halt? This is a great question. What you're describing, Arnid, is known as the death spiral. And it's this scenario that people are obviously worried about very often, but is in fact quite unlikely. The idea is this: for whatever reason, the difficulty recalculation algorithm is not based on time, but it's based on a number of blocks, meaning that the recalculation does not happen every 2 weeks. Instead, it happens every 2016 blocks. Well, it's not for a random reason. There's a very good reason for that. And the reason is that the difficulty needs to be recalculated by every single node on the network simultaneously, because difficulty is part of the consensus rules. And you don't know if a block is valid unless you know what the current difficulty is and whether the block actually achieved that level of difficulty in its proof of work. And therefore, you need to have the same difficulty as everybody else on the network, which means you have to be able to calculate the same difficulty at exactly the same time when the difficulty changes as everybody else on the network. One of the difficulties in distributed systems is that you cannot synchronize clocks reliably, and especially you cannot synchronize clocks when there is the potential of adversaries who may cause missynchronization of clocks or deliberately present a time that is later in the future or earlier in the past than the actual time you believe. Now, there are delays in the network, which means that you see things after a period of time. Maybe you're seeing a packet or block from someone because it took 30 seconds to transmit across the network, or maybe they're lying about the clock. And you can't use time reliably. There is a mechanism for using time in consensus, which is mean time, which is a consensus measure of time. And again, that uses blocks. The only reliable measure of consensus in a blockchain like Bitcoin is blocks and the proof of work that backs them. And therefore, you have to do the difficulty calculation based on a number of blocks. So difficulty is recalculated every 2016 blocks, not based on 2 weeks. Now, if your hash rate dropped by half, you lost 50% of the miners due to a catastrophe or a political change in a country that has major influence over the mining rate, then you're right. It would take much longer than 2 weeks to compensate. It would take 4 weeks. So the moment your hash rate drops by half, blocks are going to start being produced at a rate of 1 block every 20 minutes instead of 1 block every 10 minutes. We have, in fact, seen this on proof of work networks that are similar to Bitcoin, where the hash rate drops dramatically. We've even seen it in Bitcoin's own testnet. So this effect is where you have a real slowdown in the network. Now you're producing blocks every 20 minutes. Now, if the hash rate dropped by 66%, you'd be producing 1 block every 30 minutes, and it would take 6 weeks to recalculate the difficulty to fix that. If the hash rate dropped 75%, it would take 8 weeks to recalculate the difficulty and recover the network. In fact, in any difficulty recalculation, the maximum change in difficulty is a factor of 4. So the maximum difficulty that can change in that 2000 block period is either to increase it by a factor of 4, make it 4 times more difficult, or decrease it by a factor of 4, make it 4 times more easy. That's the maximum range you can move in. So there is this possibility, but remember, this would take a catastrophic decline in the difficulty. A lot of people have proposed various changes in the difficulty retargeting algorithm to use some kind of adaptive algorithm, depending on how big the change is, how many blocks to wait, and things like that. But all of these things involve changes to consensus and also other risks, which are that someone will manipulate the hash rate in order to manipulate the difficulty algorithm. In fact, we have seen this exact same thing happen in forks of Bitcoin, where the difficulty was manipulated, where just after so just before a difficulty retargeting, miners would withdraw their hashing power, cause the difficulty to recalculate lower, and then once it recalculated lower, push all of their hashing power back onto this fork, and then have a lot of blocks being generated in a short period of time. This is a complicated algorithm, but the actual theory that you will have a death spiral where the Bitcoin blockchain grinds to a halt doesn't really stand up to serious scrutiny. First of all, it would take a very dramatic drop in hash rate. And as long as you have a lot of hash rates across a lot of mining computers, across a lot of mining farms, across a lot of mining pools distributed in a lot of different parts of the world, that becomes less likely. It's much more likely to happen on a very small chain with not much hash rate. The second part of that, of course, is that if something like that happened, then there is an opportunity for the entire network to do a hard fork to simply change the difficulty retargeting algorithm. If you're waiting for 12 weeks and you know it's going to take 12 weeks until you get to the next retarget, and in that time you've got blocks coming out once an hour, well, maybe it's time to do a quick hard fork to fix the difficulty algorithm. It's not impossible. Next question from Arnid. Whenever a miner finds a hash small enough for the difficulty, the miner gets a reward. How is this transaction signed? What signatures are used? Where do they come from? That's a very good question, Arnid. And this really has to do with how the block is constructed. Let's look at it first from the perspective of a single miner, a solo miner, and then we'll talk about mining pools in a second. Let's say you have one mining company that has very powerful mining equipment. Well, what they do is every time they construct a candidate block, which is a block that they're going to apply all of their hashing power in order to find proof of work, the first transaction they put into that block, which is called the Coinbase transaction, is a payment to an address that they control the private key to. So what they have is they have a private key. Maybe it's a hierarchical deterministic wallet. Maybe it's the result of a Trezor hardware wallet or a Ledger hardware wallet, or it's a cold storage address. It doesn't really matter. It's just an address. They take that address and they write a transaction that pays that address the block reward, all of the fees plus the current block reward for that block. And then they try to make that a real transaction. It's not a real transaction because they've put it in a block that doesn't have proof of work. In order to make it a real transaction, they have to do two things. One, they have to hash that block until they find a proof of work that is valid according to the current difficulty. Let's say they get lucky. They find that proof of work. That becomes a valid block. They broadcast it to the rest of the network. Everybody sees it. Everybody accepts it. Everybody records it on the blockchain, and then everybody starts mining a new block on top of that. They can't cash that money yet. They have to wait 100 blocks. After 100 other blocks have been added on top, then they can take the private key that corresponds to the address that they just paid that reward to, and they can use that to spend that reward, for example, to an exchange, to pay for their electricity, or to buy a Lambo. And so the idea here is that you write a check to yourself. That check isn't valid unless you put all of the hashing power behind it and are lucky enough to find a proof of work that is valid for that block. And even then, you can't spend it immediately. You have to wait until that block is 100 blocks old. has 100 confirmations effectively. And that's to ensure that there isn't a reorganization of the chain, making that block invalid after you've already spent it. So 100 confirmations to spend a mining reward. Let's take a little break here. I'm going to check with the chat room and see how everybody's doing. All right. Aston has a number of questions regarding empty blocks. First question, Aston asks, what are the odds for an empty block to win the mining race since it has a head start? Well, keep in mind, Aston, that one of the reasons miners will start mining empty blocks is because they can't start mining a candidate block with transactions in it until they are absolutely sure that those transactions are not spending something that was confirmed and already spent, double spent, in the previous block. So when they receive the previous block, it takes some time to validate it. In many cases, they have to retrieve some of the transactions to look at the details. Then they have to validate every one of the transactions in that previous block, validate everything else about the block, and then they have to clear out their own mempool of all of the transactions that have already been spent so that they don't include those, and what's left is what they can put in a candidate block. It is very dangerous to put a transaction in a candidate block until you've validated the entire history of the blockchain until that moment, because you might end up putting a transaction that is double spending money that has already been confirmed, in which case you're going to put all of your hash power behind a block that is invalid. And it's invalid because it has a double spend transaction in it. Everybody will reject it. You've wasted all of that electricity. In the time it takes from the moment a miner receives a block until the moment the miner has validated that previous block, they're not going to stop mining. So what they're going to do is they're going to quickly construct a candidate block that's empty, and they're going to start mining that. Now, keep in mind, a miner doesn't have to continue mining the same block until they either find a solution or lose the race. They can switch blocks halfway through. So let's say they receive a candidate block, and then for the next 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes, they mine an empty block. After 2 minutes, let's say they've received all of the other transactions in the previous block, and they validated them all. So now they know that those transactions are valid, the block's valid. They clear out their mempool. Now they're ready to put some transaction. They build a new candidate block, and they fill it in with transactions so they can earn some more profit, not just the reward, but also the fees by filling in the block. And then they send that block to replace the empty block that's being mined. Now, if in the first couple of minutes, while they're mining the empty block because they haven't validated everything, they happen to find the solution to the proof of work, that's a great block. In fact, that block, even though it's empty and doesn't include any transactions, increases the security of the Bitcoin network by providing more proof of work on the chain. And you haven't really wasted any time because you can then immediately start mining another block, and maybe you'll get some transactions in that one. The fact that you found one doesn't change the probability of finding the next. Those are two independent probability events. That's a difficult thing to keep in mind, but it's really important. Just because you found heads 3 times in a row when you flipped a coin doesn't mean that the chances of finding tails are less if the coin is correct next time. So the odds of the empty block to win the mining race when it has a head start are, at least in the beginning, slightly better. As you get closer to the 10-minute time, then obviously you're more likely to have a full block because the miners are going to be motivated by profit to replace the candidate block that they're mining with one that has transactions so they can also earn the fees. And the fees could be a significant percentage of the reward. And if the empty block wins the race, it is added to the blockchain. It is a valid block. You absolutely add empty blocks to the blockchain. We see that, in fact, a certain percentage of blocks are mined empty. And it's important to remember, this is not wasted. This increases the security of the chain, even though it doesn't have transactions in it. And that hash rate was used to secure the chain. It added a confirmation to all of the previous transactions, and it didn't reduce the amount of time you have to mine the next block anyway. So it's added to the blockchain. Empty blocks are fine. And if the mining node receives a few blocks almost at the same time, it chooses the longest difficulty chain. So this is really interesting, which is, Aston asks, how does the mining node work out the total mining power since the verification process is very, very fast? Within the block, there will be a proof of work that has a certain amount of difficulty behind it. So the way the algorithm, the consensus algorithm, chooses, in the beginning, when Satoshi designed it in the beginning, the design was to pick the chain that had the most blocks, the longest chain, in terms of counting how many blocks. That was changed. And it was changed shortly after inception to make it instead the longest cumulative difficulty, or greatest cumulative difficulty, which means you add up the amount of difficulty that is expressed by the proof of work. And if you think about it, proof of work, because it has those leading zeros in the hash, represents a certain amount of difficulty. The more leading zeros it has, the more difficult it was to find that. So if you add up all of that difficulty together of all of the blocks, you have the cumulative difficulty that is expressed by a chain. And if you have two competing chains, which have, for example, two blocks at the end, both of which are valid, both of which arrived almost at the same time, both of which have been fully validated, contain the correct proof of work, then you pick the one that has the highest cumulative difficulty. The chances that you're going to find the identical hash are pretty much zero. So the two blocks will be different. And they'll be different by enough difficulty to be able to pick between the two chains. Obviously, if one of the chains is longer by a single block, then it will almost certainly have more difficulty. There are a few exceptions to that, but for most purposes, greatest cumulative difficulty will also mean longest chain. But if the chains are of equal length, then you can just add up all of the proof of work and pick one of the two. Aston also asks, will it be possible that the empty block consumes more mining power as the nonce may reach a much larger number before the proof of work problem is solved? Not really, because whether you have one transaction or 1,000 transactions in the block, the Merkle root, which is the part of the header that is affected by the number of transactions, whether you only have one transaction, you will have one, and that's the Coinbase transaction. The miner is going to pay themselves a reward. Or you have 1,000 transactions, the block header is still going to have one 256-bit Merkle root in there, which represents the top of the tree of all of the transactions. We'll talk about Merkle roots in a further part of the course. But essentially, the transactions are all hashed together to produce a summary, so that the summary of all transactions is always 256 bits, regardless of how many transactions you have. It doesn't. The header is exactly the same size, and the amount of mining power it takes to find proof of work of that difficulty is exactly the same, regardless of whether there are more transactions or less. This is an important question because a lot of misunderstanding in Bitcoin comes from the fact that in the popular press and media, you'll often see the assertion that as the Bitcoin network grows in the number of transactions, mining will become more difficult. This is not true. This is, in fact, incorrect. The number of transactions is not related to the amount of difficulty at all. There is no correlation at all between how many transactions you have in the block or the network as a whole and how much difficulty there is in finding solutions. Difficulty is determined entirely by how many other miners are also trying and is always adjusted to keep one thing constant, which is to have a block come out every 10 minutes. And therefore, difficulty in transactions are uncorrelated values. Quick check in the chat room. Let's see if everybody's keeping up. A quick follow-up question from Magnus. Why mine an empty block? What's the benefit for the miner? Well, the miner gets a reward. They'll still get their 12.5 Bitcoin reward, even if they don't get fees from any transaction. And they have the mining equipment running 24 hours a day. If they can't turn it off for the 2 minutes, or let's say 2 or 3 minutes that they're waiting to verify the previous block. So if during that time they have the mining equipment running, it's using electricity anyway, why not just give it an empty block to keep it busy? You'll still get 12.5 Bitcoin if you're lucky enough to find one, and then you can move on to mining the next block. In fact, you'll have a fantastic advantage because you mined the previous one, so you already know what the solution is. Therefore, there is a lot of advantage to mining empty blocks. You can make reward very, very quickly, and you keep your mining equipment running 24/7. There's a few other follow-up questions that are maybe a bit off topic or late to the game. You have to ask your questions in the forum during the course. And let's see if I can find a few here. CCG asks, how can one verify that a Bitcoin address belongs to a specific person, meaning that the owner wants to verify the ownership of the address? That's a great question, and it's part of this week's course. So I want to explain that in a bit more detail. You prove you own an address by signing something with the private key. That's how you prove you own it. That's how you prove to the Bitcoin network that you own the money that is stored in that address or that is recorded against that address. And therefore, when you sign a transaction, what you're doing is you're taking the data in the transaction and you're applying a digital signature to that data with your private key that can be verified by your public key and therefore address. And that allows anybody on the network to verify that you, in fact, own the private key that corresponds to that address. But you don't have to sign a transaction. You could sign a message. You could say, I am Satoshi Nakamoto. And you could take that text message and you could sign it with a private key that corresponds to one of the Bitcoin addresses from the first block. And what that would prove is that you have the private key to the address. Now, that still doesn't prove that you were the first person to have that key. It doesn't prove that you're the only person to have that key. It just proves that you also have that key. Maybe more than one person has it. Maybe the key was stolen. But it does prove that you have the private key behind the address. In fact, it's the easiest proof is to sign a text message with the private key behind a specific address. Alexios asks, where is the mempool located and how can a transaction from a Bitcoin user reach all miners? That is a great question, Alexios. And it is, in fact, an area that causes a lot of confusion, especially among new users of Bitcoin. There is no the mempool. There is a mempool on every single Bitcoin node. Every computer that is participating in the Bitcoin network has its own mempool. And it's not necessarily the same as everybody else's mempool. So there is no one mempool. There are tens of thousands of mempools, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of mempools maintained independently by every single computer that is participating in the Bitcoin network and maintaining a mempool. My Bitcoin node has my mempool running on its computer. And what it's doing is it's recording what transactions exist that remain unconfirmed from my node's perspective. What has my node heard in the network around it? Now, eventually, most of the computers on the Bitcoin network will receive the same transactions. Eventually, mostly the same transactions. Maybe 99+% the same transactions. They won't receive them in exactly the same order. For simplicity purposes, imagine that the internet routing was the same as geography. And now imagine that you have a computer in London that is listening for transactions and is trying to construct a mempool of its own that says what transactions have not been confirmed, right? And then imagine you have another computer that is in Shanghai, China, that is also constructing a mempool. Well, now let's say a user in New York and a user in Sydney, Australia create transactions simultaneously, and they start telling everybody who's connected to them. And then everybody who's connected to them tells every other node that's connected to them, and every other node that's connected to them, and every other node that's connected to them. And gradually, you have this flood. And imagine these transactions propagating across the network. Now, if you have a node in London, it's going to see the transaction from New York probably first. And then a bit later, the transaction from Australia is going to arrive. For the node in Shanghai, the transaction from Australia is going to be seen first, and maybe the one from New York is going to arrive a bit later. Of course, on the internet, being close geographically is not the same as being close from a routing perspective, so it doesn't quite work out that way, but it's the same general idea. Nodes that are in different parts of the internet will hear transactions from their immediate neighbors, and then they will validate them and tell all their neighbors about those transactions, gradually causing these transactions to ripple out from the point of origin until they reach the furthest reaches of the Bitcoin network, and everybody has seen these transactions. When you look at a website that tells you what transactions are unconfirmed, or you look at a website that's collecting transaction statistics from a mempool, what they're doing is they have a computer that is constructing a mempool, and they're showing you their perspective of the network. And that perspective depends very much on where exactly in the network they are. But eventually, all transactions will more or less reach all computers more or less on the network. It's not a perfect system. So when a user creates a transaction, it reaches all miners simply because as it propagates across the network, eventually it's going to arrive at the computers that all of the miners are running, which are each constructing their own mempool. And from their perspective, they will all eventually see that transaction. They may see it arrive later or before other transactions. And that's why the candidate blocks that miners will create will have slight differences, because one of the differences is that they receive transactions in a different order than everybody else. So let's say those transactions have the exact same fee. Well, maybe I'm going to add transactions A, B, and C, which have the exact same fee in that order. But another node will instead add them as C, A, B, and another node will add them as B, C, A. Again, those are going to construct 3 different blocks, which are going to have 3 different headers, which are going to produce completely different header hashes, block hashes. And that's a result of not having one mempool, but having hundreds of thousands, maybe mempools, or tens of thousands of mempools on each computer. One on each computer. Great questions today. I'm really enjoying these. Let's go a bit further and check the chat room. Juan Pablo asks, is it possible to create a decentralized mining pool? Have someone tried to do so? Absolutely. In fact, a number of attempts have been made in that respect. Probably the most successful is called P2 pool, which is peer-to-peer pool. P2 pool, P number 2, POOL. P2 pool is a protocol that actually is a mining pool that is decentralized. That's probably the best example, one that has been quite successful, and you can see its statistics on various sites as to how much hashing power it has. The advantage of P2 pool is that mining is managed in a decentralized manner, and it actually uses a blockchain of its own in order to distribute the mining rewards and to measure the contribution of each miner in the pool so that no one is in charge of the mining pool. So it's a collaborative mining pool blockchain that works to mine Bitcoin. It's a fascinating system. There is, however, a disadvantage, and the disadvantage is that the rewards are not as smooth and not as high as if you have a centralized pool. So as in many other things with decentralized networks, a centralized mining pool is slightly more efficient than a decentralized one, and it can deliver more consistent rewards and slightly higher rewards than a decentralized pool. Of course, the disadvantage is that miners who participate in a centralized pool are giving up a lot of their power, their political power, their decision power, to the mining pool operator that can control, for example, which transactions get included or how to vote on a fork proposal and things like that. Whereas miners who participate in a decentralized pool keep more of their power at a slight cost of efficiency. It's actually one of those things that is really sad to see because most miners choose slightly higher profit and smoother profit, even at the expense of some centralization in the mining pools. But this is an active area of research, and who knows, we might see better decentralized mining pools in the future. Eric has a number of questions again about mining. Obviously, this is a very interesting topic and probably one of the hardest topics to understand in Bitcoin. So I'm glad we have all of these great questions. Eric asks, how fast do new blocks propagate through the whole Bitcoin network, and what kind of obstacles to propagation can occur? New blocks propagate in a matter of seconds. Now, that very much depends on where you're located and what kind of network you're connected to. You see, there are not just one Bitcoin network. There is the peer-to-peer Bitcoin network that most regular nodes and some wallets use, the Bitcoin network as we call it. And that network propagates blocks in a matter of 8 to 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds, depending on where you are and what your connectivity is, what the latency of the link is, etc. And there are some mechanisms to accelerate propagation of blocks by compressing them. Compact blocks is one example of that. Now, the reason this is a critical issue is because if you're a miner, every second counts. In fact, time is money. In the mining game, this is more true than most other markets. So one of the issues here is that the regular peer-to-peer network isn't fast enough for miners, which is why miners use other networks to propagate blocks between themselves much, much faster. And these networks are designed to be low latency, cut-through protocol networks that use various tricks and optimizations to really, really speed up the propagation of blocks to the miners. You see, the internet is designed to be a general purpose network, and TCP is a protocol that is very flexible, but not particularly fast. And more importantly, it doesn't have the latency characteristics. Latency is the time it takes from the beginning of a transmission on one end until that transmission is received on the other end. The transition across the network. And latency can vary greatly. You sometimes, if you're a gamer, you know how important latency is in real-time games. And you might count that in a matter of milliseconds across the network using a technique like ping, which gives you the latency. It's not a very accurate measurement mechanism, and it depends on a lot of other factors. If you're a miner, latency is money. Every millisecond you spend waiting for a block is time that you can't create a candidate block with transactions in it, and therefore you're going to lose out on some fees if you're mining an empty block. It's time that you're spending waiting for transactions and blocks to arrive, to be processed and validated by your nodes. So rather than using a general purpose protocol like TCP, and rather than using the regular network capabilities that you have on the internet, there are specially designed networks that use the internet, but they use UDP protocols and very, very thin protocol stacks that are specialized, kind of like the network equivalent of an ASIC, if that makes any sense. It's application specific, and it's designed to be extremely low latency. Some of the best research in that area is done by Matt Corallo, or BlueMat, as he's known on Twitter. And Matt Corallo is kind of the networking genius in the Bitcoin space, and has designed a couple of different iterations of the networks that are used to connect miners together. Very, very low latency, very fast networks, and has done most of the work on the networking stack in the Bitcoin Core client. So if you're interested in that, have a look at the work of Matt Corallo, BlueMat, works that exist out there. The names are escaping my mind right now. I would love to tell you the names of those. Maybe we can discuss them in the next session and talk about these. Eric asks, do all nodes simultaneously receive the announcement of the new block which has the proof of work completed successful? Is there some advantage or disadvantage to a node receiving that new block data earlier or later than other nodes? Eric, I can see that you already are beginning to understand some of the really tricky economics of mining. And of course, there is an enormous advantage to being able to receive that block, the newly discovered block with successful proof of work, before every other miner. This is a race. If you hear the start gun go off and you start running before everybody else, you have a better chance to win. And if you repeat that over thousands and thousands and thousands of blocks, even a few milliseconds can make the difference, which could mean an enormous amount of money in the long run. Latency is enormously important. And therefore, there is enormous disadvantage if you have a slow network. There's enormous disadvantage if your network is being filtered by firewalls that slow things down. That's one of the disadvantages of operating mining in China. And it also means that miners spend a lot of money on optimizing networks in order to make sure that they receive that new block as fast as possible. Remember, the fact that you receive a new block means you have lost the race. And as soon as you know you have lost the race, you have to start running the next block and stop wasting any more time on the previous block. In order to do that, you have to change the candidate block on all of your mining equipment as quickly as possible, usually with an empty block, and then later after you've verified things. So the race starts, and network latency is gold. Is there any disadvantage or advantage to being as close as possible to the original mining node that solved the proof of work problem and broadcast the new block? Yes, absolutely. In fact, there is enormous disadvantage if you're on the other side of a firewall or other divider, which actually creates pressure to centralize mining in certain regions because of network latency. So for example, if the majority of miners are located in China, then if you have mining equipment outside of China and most of the new blocks are being found in China, then they receive them immediately through very fast networks that they operate behind the firewall of China, and everybody else in the world receives them with a slight delay, which means now there's advantage to being in China as long as that's where most of the blocks are being found, and a disadvantage being outside because you have greater latency. So this is one of the centralization pressures that exist in the Bitcoin network, whereby, because latency is such an important factor, miners will cluster together in order to reduce the latency and be able to generate blocks as soon as they receive the previous block. Cade asks, what are your thoughts on ASIC-resistant mining in general? I think ASIC-resistant mining is really just a matter of time and profit. Any algorithm can be made into silicon as an application-specific integrated circuit. Now, some mining algorithms which have greater demands on memory are less efficient to make in an ASIC or more difficult to make in an ASIC, or they require more memory in the ASIC, which makes the ASIC more complex to manufacture. And in that case, miners won't build or hire companies to build chips specifically for that mining algorithm unless it is very profitable to mine that specific algorithm. So as long as your mining algorithm isn't very profitable, you don't have to worry about ASICs. ASICs are expensive. Bitcoin was ASIC resistant when it wasn't that expensive. When the reward wasn't worth a lot of money, there wasn't any point in building ASICs. GPUs were fine. CPUs were fine. FPGAs, there are levels and levels of specialization. But if there is enough profit pressure, no algorithm is ASIC resistant. So ASIC resistant isn't a yes or no type of question. You can't say, is this algorithm ASIC resistant? You can say, is this algorithm more ASIC resistant than that algorithm? You can say, is this algorithm ASIC resistant at $100,000 per block value and profit for the miner? Is it still ASIC resistant at $1 million a block? Is it still ASIC resistant at $1 billion a block? I can tell you no algorithm is resistant at $1 billion a block because at that point, you will build an ASIC for that. So again, this is a relative scale. ASIC resistance has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage, of course, of building ASIC-resistant algorithms is that you can have distribution of the mining more broadly spread across companies that don't have access to silicon fabrication factories. But the disadvantages are multiple. One of them is, of course, that ASIC-resistant mining drives general-purpose graphic processing units, or GPUs, the graphics cards that gamers really want, but they can't buy anymore because the miners already bought them all. Over the last years, we've seen a massive amount of demand for graphic processing units, and this demand has led to very large increases in prices and constant problems with supply, to the point that in many countries, there are limits. If you go into a store and try to buy a graphics card, they'll give you 1, maybe 2, but you can't buy 100, you can't buy 10, you can't even buy 5. Even if you have the money, they won't give them to you. So that's because of restrictions in supply that have been caused by over-reliance on GPUs and the enormous demand for GPUs that was generated by ASICs, or by ASIC-resistant mining, which of course is not GPU-resistant. It's very difficult to make something GPU-resistant because that's general enough that it can handle pretty much any algorithm. Now, then again, there's another problem. If you have really ASIC-resistant mining, and it can be mined on a GPU, or worse yet, on a CPU, a lot of people will think, great, I would love to have an algorithm that could only be mined on CPU. That would create the ultimate democracy of mining. Then you would really have one CPU, one vote. No, you wouldn't. What you would have is one botnet of 100,000 hacked computers belonging to your computer illiterate relatives whose Windows computers and Mac computers in their living rooms and their video game consoles and even maybe their printer and their air conditioner and their vacuum cleaner are all overheating because they're being marshaled into a massive hacked botnet in order to give one hacker one vote, not one CPU one vote. And that's the big disadvantage of having ASIC resistant mining. You will notice that you see articles all the time where they say printers or supercomputers or wireless networks or IoT devices have been taken over from mining. It's not Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin mining isn't profitable on devices like that because of ASICs. It's mining for chains that are supposedly ASIC resistant, which are CPU friendly, and the result is that hackers will hack 1 million computers in order to use them for mining. So ASIC resistant is a double-edged sword. Great. I think that covers everything. Yes, we've coined a new phrase, one hacker, one vote. And I hope you enjoyed today's session. This was session 3 of the Massive Open Online course. This is our 10th iteration of the course for the master's degree in digital currencies for the University of Nicosia. I've been answering your questions. I'm Andreas Antonopoulos. It's been a great pleasure. Please participate in the forums. Ask great questions. Let's have another great session like this next week and enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much.